just a while. Let's keep it up there. Don't lose the theme. Lose the theme and you lose all. Cha-ching-ching. That's true, of course, in life as it is in other man's activities. You lose the theme and you're in trouble. Cha-cha-cha, cha-da-cha. Or have you had a sneaking suspicion that your life has no theme? And, you're in company, good company, with many, many well-qualified philosophers who say that. The plot theory of life, or the theme concept of existence, is an old canard that has been foisted off on poor suffering mankind for far too long. Cha-da-cha, cha-cha-da-cha. We were not quoting Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, in case you're interested. This is February 22nd. February 22nd, and this is the birth date of the father of our country. And, all the people, almost from the very beginning of the time that you first heard about George Washington, you hear about him in the terms of legend, He's almost a mythical figure, like Alexander the Great or Hannibal. I mean, these people really lived, but there's a sense of mythology. I was watching a movie here a couple of weeks ago, a very good one, by the way, with Richard Burton in it. And it was one of the early Burton movies. It was made in England. Oh, it was really beautifully done. And he was Alexander the Great. And it's a curious thing when you see Alexander the Great in a movie. He's going along on a horse, and you just see a bunch of guys following him on horses, and you see the hills. And I had this little sneaking feeling of, if there was a guy standing over in a hill there somewhere with a bunch of sheep or something looking down, and he looks down and he sees this man go by on a horse with 4 or 5 other men, maybe 10 other men. There was a scene when he came into one of the villages when he was very young, Alexander the Great. He was about 18 or 19, something like that. And he was coming into a village with a group of soldiers. And they just galloped in. They came in there, and you could see the horses and kicking up the dirt and the people looking out of the window. And somebody was walking past carrying a basket full of fish or something on their head and so on. And, it was Greece, And he went down the street, and I thought to myself, those people looking out, the guy walking past with the dog and all that, I wonder if they could have conceivably have comprehended they were looking upon a man, of course it's impossible, who ultimately would be literally a genuine mythological figure, Alexander the Great, descended from the gods, descended from the eagles. As he walks, riding a horse, he goes past. Well, it must have been the same thing with Washington. Although, curiously enough, a lot of people, just as in the case of Alexander the Great, by the way, a lot of people during Alexander the Great's lifetime recognized him as a man of almost, at that point, godlike characteristics, totally remote and removed from the men of his time. And a lot of the writing, the contemporary writing, refers to him in those terms. And that is true. Are you aware that that's true of Washington? Many of the people who witnessed Washington, for example, there's an account, a description of George Washington rallying the men at a point right here on Manhattan when they were suffering a lot of defeats, and they went all the way up from the Battle of Murray Hill. They went all the way on up to Washington Heights, which is incidentally named after that battle, went across the Harlem River, and there is a contemporary account of George Washington rallying, galloping up and down, and getting the retreat under control, getting it organized, where this writer, the person who wrote, I don't recall now who it was who wrote about Washington in those terms, I'm dragging this out of my memory, who wrote about him almost in the same terms that they wrote about Alexander the Great. And perhaps, a mythical man, literally, as he walked around. And yet, he was, he was like, can you imagine a guy going to school now? That reminds me of Alexander the Great. Can you imagine somebody going to school under under Aristotle. That was his teacher. It was Alexander the Great's teacher, Aristotle. And I mean, just see, there again is another mythical man, Aristotle. And I can just see Alexander the Great getting bugged by his teacher, as is the case always with students, going back to his pads and that old fool. Shh, they don't understand. And Aristotle himself, he sees this wise, this smart, what kid going back to his pad, and he's the gnarled, grizzled veteran, the great thinker of his time. And he sees this kid going back and says, "Oh boy, they sure ain't the way they used to be. I'll tell you." and it just had to be. But during the days of George Washington exemplifies, and I think in a way this is the great difference between Washington and, say, somebody like Alexander the Great. Washington exemplifies the American hero. And he had to go through all the things which literally are the American. Yes, the American concept of heroism is very different from the European concept of heroism. For example, the European concept of heroism is a classical hero. Now, by a classical hero, I mean he's a hero who must have the proper requisites for heroism. He comes out of a society that is highly stratified. Europe. Oh, yes, Europe. Let's face it, in Europe you do have the nobility. In Europe you do have, by stratified, I mean genuinely stratified in the sense of the caste system. A good example of that, of the inability of the European to accept a man who, or to, let's say, reject a man because he doesn't have the proper requisites, is the great body of European scholars who refuse to accept Shakespeare, primarily because he didn't go to the right school. They cannot find anywhere that he went to Oxford. They just cannot find anywhere that he was involved with Cambridge at any point in his life. And so ultimately they say he can't possibly have done that. It's inconceivable that he could have done this. And so they have to assign it to any one of 45 well-recognized graduates of Oxford and or Cambridge, anything else that's official, you see. No, this is quite true. This is a very basic snobism. Now, George Washington was a stripe of a totally different type of cat, really. He came out of another world entirely. And if you will please give me a little patriotic music there, I'm going to do a show now. I might as well warn you, I'm going to do a show on George Washington tonight. It is George Washington's birthday. And by God, I hope when my birthday comes around, somebody will do a show on me somewhere. Bring it up there. All right. Now, to begin with, you've got... All right, that's it. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough music. Kill it. Kill it. To begin with, you've got to understand that Washington was not a patriot in the accepted sense of the term in his day. You know what a patriot would have been in Washington's youth? A guy who really honored the king. After all, that was an English colony, you know. And patriotism was defined by your belief in and your involvement with the home country. And the more you were pro George III or whoever was king at the time when he was a boy, the more you were involved with the mother country, the better off you were as far as and he was genuinely a hippie of his day. No, don't laugh. Now I'm going to read from a very thin book, which is a part of the writings of George Washington himself. And it's a fascinating book because not only does it talk about the life and times of the people of those days, I mean the daily life, more than that, it comes out of the George Washington who was 15 years old. He was 15 when he wrote this book. He was not the father of the country. He was something else entirely. And I will first of all quote to you from the preface of this book, which was written by, the preface was written by a man named, let me see, where is it here? Yeah, John Allen Murphy. It was done back in the late 30s and early 40s. And it's beautifully illustrated, little woodcuts, one thing and another, and it's called George Washington's Rules for Civility. A little Mozart, please. George Washington's Rules of Civility. How to live. How to be accepted into polite society. How to get along with your fellow man. Written by George Washington at the age of 15. Have you ever heard these? First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. George Washington also was first in good manners. This, a quality inherent in him, he instilled in others by himself, living his rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Written, many people believe, at 15. But the year is by no means clear. Not until 1748, at 16, his soul had cause to cry out against ill manners. He stood more than 6 feet tall at 16, slender, awkward, self-conscious, with big hands and big feet. He had left school at 15, a dropout, a family problem. He really was. Lawrence Washington, his eldest half-brother, took young George in hand and brought him to his home, Mount Vernon. You want to hear more about this? Lawrence had married into the family of Lord Fairfax. And in this excellent company, George suddenly found himself pained to the heart by the titters of beautiful girls and the amusement that he afforded his elders by his ungainly manners and his clumsy grace. George, in his misery, seated on the banks of the Potomac, found no solace for his deficiencies, even in such books as he read, called Youth's Behavior, or Decency in Conversation Amongst Men, a best-selling book of 1664 by Francis Hawkins, brought from England. He was aware at that point that he just did not belong. George Washington did not make it. No, you just never think of that about George Washington, do you? It must have been then that he sought out his old school copybook to inscribe in his own boyish handwriting his principles of good manners. Some of the original has been gnawed by mice. You want to hear about the actual? They still have the book. Some of the original has been gnawed by mice. Some of the words are gone, but otherwise restored and in custody of the Library of Congress. It is a touching and human document of an overgrown boy improving on Hawkins' rules of etiquette. They feel that he wrote them down to remind himself on why he wasn't making it. The maxims so fully exemplify Washington's life that they're regarded as the formative influences in the development of his character. And, speaking of not making it, this is WOR, AM and FM, New York. And speaking of ill manners, will you please hit one of the buttons for one of those very loud commercials, please?
Gene Shepard has been pondering the good life, and he concludes,
to many of us, there are just 3 things that are absolute necessities. A roof over one's head, food on the table, and the New York Times. Why? New York Times is a way of life, a gigantic novel about the world itself. Every day is the beginning of another chapter or the end of a chapter, and you never know how it's going to turn out. It's exciting. It is a total mystique. It is a philosophy, or who knows what it is. But I can tell you this, anything else seems flat, insipid, and almost senseless. The New York Times is a mystique, and it's also a pretty good dime's worth.
Don't miss today's chapter in the last of the great dime novels, the New York Times. If you're without it, you're not with it. For home delivery, call Murray Hill 70700. That's MU70700.
Like the taste of real draft beer? Now you can take it home with you. Peels did it. Put real draft beer in 12-ounce cans. Try it yourself. You'll agree. It's really draft beer in a can, and it needs no refrigeration until you're ready to drink it. The only thing we didn't put in the can is the atmosphere of your favorite tavern.
They didn't catch the atmosphere of the taverns I know. I'll tell you that. All that yelling and hollering, that gunplay. You know, I miss Bob and Ray. I miss Harry and Bert. You remember Harry and Bert? Well, that's right. This is a purely American reference I'm making here. Oh, while on the subject of commercials, we'll get back to George Washington very shortly here. We have Rover. George probably would have disdained the Rover. I can imagine a revolution today where they throw in Boston Harbor 17 Rovers overboard. The Rover is an English car and an excellent one. And if you have not seen this car, I think you owe it to yourself before the spring comes around when you buy a new car. Many people do. That you see this car, because if you buy a Rover this year, believe me, you won't be buying a new car for a long time to come. This is a machine that's built to last. It's built with real quality in it. Of course, the Rover. By the way, they use Rovers on, I see one of the big hunting shows on Sunday. The show, you know, where they're going out and they're killing all the rhinos and all that, and they get people like Tab Hunter to go and to blow up buffaloes with hand grenades and stuff. A very intellectual show. I wish they really did it as pop art. Why don't they get people who really would be interesting to watch? For example, get Bertrand Russell goes out after warthogs. I mean, that I think would really be something to watch. Who wants to watch Craig Stevens shoot quail? You know, it would be much more fun if they could get, say, let's say Rona Jaffe goes out and goes after man-eating sharks, something like that. I mean, really, that's the way I do the show. But nevertheless, we have with us Rover, and if you've ever seen that show, you've seen them use Land Rovers, which they use to chase the poor old water buffalo all over the veldt. So it's a great car, and the car that we're talking about, however, is the Rover 2000, which is the same company. They build the Land Rover, and they're one of the great automobile manufacturers of the world. A superb machine, and the Rover 2000 is one of the greatest. Okay, you have another little whoopee in there for us? There you go. Hit it again there.
My name doesn't matter. Let's just say I'm a highly paid executive of the Ludens Company. I must report to you that our campaign to discourage people from chewing Ludens cough drops is a partial failure. We have tried every way we know to get you chewers to dissolve Ludens cough drops slowly, so the medication can trickle down slowly, to give you temporary relief from coughs due to colds and minor sore throat. What can we do to make you understand? Should we engineer Ludens cough drops so that they make embarrassing sounds when you chew one, like this? Should we publish the names of known chewers? Those of you out there who chew Ludens cough drops, please write us your suggestions. Address your letter to me, Mr. X, the Ludens Never Chew Society, Ludens, Reading, Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry, I like that commercial. You know, I wish Ludens cough drops did go I think that if they did build that noise into cough drops, they would increase the sales by 27,000%. You know, just. All right, let's see. We have one more, then we get back to old George. Let's see. It says, now you can look your best in a new Woolworth made-to-measure suit or coat and save money. By the way, I did not mention that I went over and I got a beautiful blazer from Woolworth. You know, blazers are a very tricky coat, in case you've never bought one. I can tell you this, they are tricky. They either look like a crummy old sack, or they are the best-looking coat in the business. There is no in-between. It's a peculiar thing. It's like pregnancy. You either are or you're not. And I have bought a couple of blazers that I quickly hid back around, back in the back of the closet, you know, with the fielder's mitts and the gloves and stuff. But seriously, I picked up a beautiful blazer at Woolworth. And if you're looking for a place where you want to get a blazer made to fit you, I mean made to measure, really to fit you, I would suggest Woolworth. If you're in school and you want to get a really good blazer, I would highly recommend. And by the way, at a price you can afford. They really make them. And they have about, the selection of material for them is, there must be 200 just for the blazer. So, this is Woolworth, and they're having a big sale during January and February. And so, let's see, it says you don't need cash, you have a credit card and so on. Woolworth, W-O-H-L-M-U-T-H, America's largest made-to-measure menswear specialist. Let me see, they have one at 482 Lenox in Manhattan, another one at 1003 Southern Boulevard in the Bronx. Okay, now we're through with the commercials for a while. Let's get on with, would you please bring me a little Stars and Stripes there? There we go. Back to our salute to George Washington, who made us what we are today. You know, the funny thing about it now, one thing our engineer tonight, which is kind of ironical, is just over from England. How long have you been out of England now? 5, 6 months. Weeks! Holy smokes. 6 weeks. And I asked him, I said, what are you guys over in England? How is George Washington taught in England when you're learning history in school? And he said, bloody traitor, of course. Well, you know, it's all a matter of viewpoint, let's face it. And he is taught that way, I presume, in England. I don't know whether you ever had any involvement with the South, but you know how you'd be surprised how they treat Abraham Lincoln, for example, in certain schools in certain southern states. It just ain't the same, you know, as you get it up here in New York, or if you get it as you get it in Boston. It is totally different. But now let's go on with George Washington's rules for behavior, and he wrote these at the age of 15. In fact, as the man who wrote the preface says, there's a lot of argument as to whether or not he was 15 or 16, but it was at that period in his life that he wrote these in his copybook. The original is still in the Library of Congress, and he starts out. Now, the thing before we go into this, I have to add a little personal postscript here, or perhaps a little footnote, and that is, whenever anybody writes down rules of behavior, you have to assume that what he is inveighing against is happening. In other words, there's no point to write rules, put a big sign out there on the turnpike that says no hitchhiking, unless somebody is hitchhiking. In short, the things that he was talking about obviously happen. And so these rules are a great cross-section of life in that time, in the 18th century, the mid-18th century. In fact, it was a little bit before the mid-18th century that they were written. And it was in the peak of what they call the classical period. This was the classical period in England. It was a classical period all over the Western world, where great composers were working and great painters were at work. This was the age of reason was really beginning to boom, and yet people in their daily life, just like always in man's world, the daily life is very different from the life of the mind. That people have fantastic concepts of liberty and justice and truth, and at the same time they yell and hit their servants in the face. They do not relate it to what they're doing. And so these rules of behavior occurred, and by the way, it must be said that the time he wrote them out of is generally considered one of the most gracious periods of mankind's history. And if you don't believe it, take a look at some of their architecture that came out of that period. Monticello, places like Mount Vernon. These are beautifully designed pieces of genuine gentility, real grace. A little Mozart, please. Rule the first. George Washington's rules of civility and decent behavior in company and in conversation. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. When in company, put not your hands to any part of the body not usually discovered. That means don't scratch or show nothing to your friend that might affright him. In the presence of others, sing not to yourself with a humming noise, nor drum with the fingers or feet loudly. Somehow you just can't see Thomas Jefferson sitting there. Yes, sir, that's my baby. Cha-da-cha-da-ta-ta. If you cough, sneeze, sigh, or yawn, do it not loud, but privately. And speak not in your yawning. Well, I am, Charlie. Speak not in your yawning, but put your handkerchief or hand before your face and turn aside. Rule the 6. Sleep not when others speak. Now, I think that's a good idea. I have trouble myself that way. I remember here a couple of weeks ago at a sales meeting. Very embarrassing. And sleep not when others speak. Sit not when others stand. Speak not when you should hold your peace. Walk not on when others stop. Now, think about that now. Okay? Put not off your clothes in the presence of others, nor go out your chamber half-dressed. Must have been a lot of guys running around with their pants off during his day. Well, I mean, you know that happens. Have you been down on Greenwich lately, for crying out loud? It's everywhere. At play and at fire, it's good manners to give place to the last comer and affect not to speak louder than ordinary. Spit not in the fire, nor stoop low before it. Neither put your hands into the flames to warm them, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there be meat before it. That's not a bad idea. When you sit down, keep your feet firm and even, without putting one on the other or crossing them. Shift not yourself in the sight of others, nor gnaw your nails. You know, you just don't think of George Washington knowing about things like guys chewing their nails, you know, or yawning when they talk and all that sort of thing. Shake not the head, feet or legs. Roll not the eye. Lift not the eyebrow, one eyebrow higher than the other. Now, that's an interesting point. He says, don't lift one eyebrow higher than the other. In other words, don't start putting the other guys on, you know, give them that old look. Wry not the mouth. Wry means W-R-Y. In other words, don't make funny faces at people. And here's a great one. And bedew no man's face with your spittle by approaching too near him when you speak. Boy, that is, you know, that happens all the time. Somebody, and especially when it's a big shot talking to you. That is very embarrassing. Rule the 13th. Kill no vermin as fleas, lice, ticks in the sight of others. Now, you notice he's not saying don't have them. He's saying just don't start killing those little you-know-whats while other people are watching. If you see any filth or thick spittle, put your foot dexterously upon it. If it be upon the clothes of your companions, put it off privately so that they don't know it. And if it be upon your own clothes, return thanks to him who puts it off. Turn not your back to others, especially in speaking. Jog not the table or desk on which another writes or reads, and lean not upon anyone. Keep your nails short and clean, also your hands and teeth clean, yet without showing any great concern for them. Do not puff up the cheeks, loll out the tongue, rub the hands or beard, thrust out the lips or bite them, or keep the lips too open or too closed. This is a kid writing these things down. You know, he's trying to figure out how to make it, and he's putting these rules down for himself to remember. Be no flatterer, neither play with any that delights not to be played withal. Read no letters, books, or papers in company, but when there is a necessity for the doing of it, you must ask leave. Come not near the books or writings of another, so as to read them unless desired, or in other words, don't look over somebody's shoulder and read what he's writing, or give your opinion of them unasked. Now there's a good rule to remember. Oh, for crying, you're reading that. Oh, wow. Yeah, and do not look nigh when another is writing a letter. Let your countenance be pleasant, but in serious matters somewhat grave. The gestures of the body must be suited to the discourse you're upon. Reproach none for the infirmities of nature, nor delight to put them that have in mind thereof. This is kind of nice. Show not yourself glad at the misfortune of another, even though he is your enemy. Oh yeah, George was famous for that, even after he accepted the sword, who was it, Cornwallis? He accepted the sword, and he accepted it very graciously. Said, I'm sorry you had all that trouble, and better luck next time. It's literally true. He did. Very interesting. 23rd, when you see a crime punished, you may be inwardly pleased, but always show pity to the suffering offender. And it shows a picture, the woodcut shows a picture of a guy with his head in the stock and his tongue hanging out, and there's a guy standing next to him as he's applauding. He's cheering. Rule the 24th. Do not laugh too loud or too much at any public spectacle. 25th. Superfluous compliments and all affectation of ceremony are to be avoided. Yet when due, they are not to be neglected. Rule the 26th. Now this tells a little bit about the world, really tells about their world. In pulling off your hat to persons of distinction, such as noblemen, justices, churchmen, and make a reference, bowing, or more or less according to the custom of the better bred and quality of the person. Amongst your equals, expect not always that they should begin with you first, but to pull off the hat when there is no need is affectation. In the manner of saluting and re-saluting, in words, keep to the most usual custom. Now that tells a lot about their world, really. He is saying, don't take your hat off to a nobleman when you don't have to. But the point is, he accepts the fact you do. You must remove your hat to a nobleman and to people of higher rank. 27, 'tis ill manners to bid one more eminent than yourself be covered, as well as not to do it to whom it's due. Likewise, he that makes too much haste to put on his hat does not well. In short, you take your hat off, you put it right back on. You're putting the guy on a little bit there. Again, this is part of that rank world that they lived in, which is very, of course, it's still to be found in certain parts of the British Isles. Don't think for a minute it isn't. As a matter of fact, in Scotland, it is. I know in many of the areas in Scotland where the nobility still holds sway, much more so than in many parts of England itself. When the laird comes into town and comes into a store, it is very, very polite for everyone to take his hat off, to make a sign well, it's not really affection. It's a sign of deference to rank. And it can be affection. It can be both. But here's rule the 28th. If anyone come to speak to you while you are sitting, stand up, even though he be your inferior. And when you present seats, let it be to everyone according to his degree. You want to hear some more of these rules? They're very interesting, and these were all written. Yes, and they're part of that. They're part of that great world of manners. You know that the French court of that period, right at that time. Of course, you remember that the Americans were considered very uncouth. No, they really were to the Europeans, and to this day it remains that way. They believe we really are. And even the greatest of noblemen in America, by noblemen, I mean the people who were of the American aristocracy, were considered savages to the European aristocrat. And for that reason, when somebody like Benjamin Franklin went to Paris, he was looked upon as a fantastically fascinating savage. Yes, he was. And for that reason, he could do almost anything. Benjamin Franklin swung with every chick in sight. He really raised Cain in the French court, and they loved him for it, because he was considered kind of like the savage. And they were fascinated by him for his free and easy manners and so on. However, the French court at that time had reached such a high point of manners and rules and regulations and one thing and another that there were whole studies made of court protocol. There were books written, which are hardly ever read today except by historians, long, involved, learned discourses as to what kind of lace, how far the lace should extend below a man's sleeve, what fingers he should use to open a door. Yes, it got to be that involved. They often say that the sign of a civilization really falling apart is when manners and mannerisms become so important that the entire structure has assumed a kind of dancing angels on the head of a pin aspect. And in the French court of that time, this was the kind of world that they were living in. A man, if he had to use not only all the right forks, of course this is very superficial, but you had to wear your hat. There had to be buttons. There would be whole books written on the kind of buttons that should be worn on gentlemen's coats. The whole business of the fan language and so forth. And so there's a little bit of that in this, but not as much, you see, as you would find in Europe. It was part of the Mozartian world, the world of classical concept of manners and the betrayal of one's inner soul to your fellow citizen. Always, you protect that constantly. Here, for example, was a typical example of a rule of that period. When you meet with one of greater quality than yourself, stop and retire, especially if it be at a door or any straight place, to give way, to allow him to pass. That's like meeting your old boss Bullard in the men's room, you know, and you step aside, say you first. In walking, the highest place in most countries seems to be on the right hand. Therefore, place yourself on the left of him whom you desire to honor. But if three walk together, the mid place is the most honorable. The wall is usually the most worthy if two walk together. If anyone far surpasses others, either in age, nature, or merit, would give place to a meaner than himself in his own lodging and elsewhere, the one ought not to accept it, if he be above the lesser person. In other words, if you're a big shot, it's nice for you to say, no thanks, Charlie, you go ahead and sit. It's all right with me. See, he's giving rules even for the big people, too, to follow. To one that is your equal, or not much inferior, you are to give the chief place in your lodging, and he to whom 'tis offered ought at the first refuse it, but at the second to accept it, not without acknowledging, however, his own unworthiness. I kind of like that, you know. And way in the back, here's where he really gets down to brass tacks. Such things like, make no show of taking great delight in your victuals. Feed not with greediness. Cut your bread with a knife. Lean not on the table, and neither find fault with what you eat, particularly if you are a guest. I kind of like that, you know. Here's one. It says, take no salt or cut bread with your knife greasy. That's true. You know, a lot of these things we could live by, really, seriously. Entertaining anyone at table, it is decent to present him with meat. Undertake not to help others undesired by ye master. If you soak bread in the sauce or gravy, let it be no more than what you put in your mouth at a time, and blow not your broth at table, but stay till cools of itself. I like that rule for gravy. Don't take any more than you can stick in your mouth, is what he's saying. It's unbecoming to stoop, much less to one's meat. Keep your fingers clean, and when foul, wipe them on the corner of your table napkin in private. And this is the one I really like. Be not tedious in discourse. Don't be a bore. Make not many digressions, nor constantly repeat yourself over and over and over again. Let's see now. Be not too curious to know the affairs of others, even though you are. He says, don't show it. Here, you want to hear his final one? I think this is a great one. How much time do we have in there? 1 minute? All right, and this is his last rule. Bring on the Stars and Stripes, please. We are going to salute George. His last rule. And I suspect it's the most loaded one of all, and the most difficult of all to follow. This is his 110th rule and the last one in his copybook. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. And this great little book winds up with this comment. In his military, business, and social life, George Washington rigidly adhered to his precepts of his boyish code of etiquette. As the first president, a stickler for forms and ceremonies, it was this foundation that enabled him to initiate the first official code of formal etiquette. Thus, to George Washington, we owe our accepted usages of good manners. Even to this day, the protocol he established in Washington is still followed. So the next time, kid, your old man yells at you because you're a dropout, merely say, well, so was the father of our country. He didn't go all the way either. Very good. All right. How much time do we got before theme? All right, bring it on. I'm afraid that's it for George for another year. How old would George have been this year? We'll award the brass figuree if you can tell me what birthday this is of George Washington. And so, hail and farewell, O great chief, till next year, next February 22nd. Happy birthday to you, George. By George. Incidentally, you know that's where that term came from? By George? Oh, yeah. By George. It came from the original way that he wrote his orders. When George Washington wrote out orders to his men, he would just write, by George. And from that time on, it became a kind of an accepted, yeah, by George, meaning it's official, man.